Hello, everybody, and welcome back. Thank you very much for joining me. My name's Deborah Hatswell, and you're listening to BBR Investigations. Now, as promised, here are some of my favourite paranormal and supernatural reports, some of which that have come into me at BBR, and others are sourced from online. Was it Edgar Allan Poe who said, "I don't believe in ghosts, but I've been running from them all of my life"? Lots of us out there know what that feels like. In our first case tonight, we hear from Simon Dean, and his report is called "I Can See You." And Simon said, "I've never believed in ghosts. I've always been sceptical. I've read about sleep paralysis causing all sorts of weird things, and I think that some people make things up. My story isn't flashy. It doesn't involve moving objects or ghostly figures. But something happened to me the other night, and it's made me believe. I'm an intelligent person, and I know what I experienced was unlike anything I've ever heard before. It cannot be explained by any external factor or by sleep paralysis because I wasn't asleep. Could it be my mind? Possibly. But I would have thought I'd had something like this before. Wouldn't I have experienced something like that if that was the case? It's 1 a.m. I finished working on my computer. I went to bed, switching the lights off on the way. 30 seconds after getting into bed and closing my eyes, I started hearing some strange noises. I was hearing this like whooshing and roaring and a clattering noise. And then, out of nowhere, I heard someone whisper in a malicious sort of tone, something like, "I can see you," or "I know that you're there," followed by an almighty whoosh in my right ear that was really intensely loud. I almost felt it. I was freaked out. I didn't want to open my eyes. So without further ado, I quickly prayed and prayed earnestly to God in the name of Jesus Christ. And the experience soon died off. I felt safe again. A few days later, I related this story to my sister, who 2 weeks ago, in a different house, said she heard someone whisper to her, "What are you doing?" But no one said a thing. Just today, my niece has told her that she's heard childish laughter and even saw a grey shadow of what she described of a man standing in one of the rooms. I'm convinced now that there are ghosts. That being the case, then there's an afterlife. That means there's a God. Does this story make sense to anybody? Thanks, Simon. I don't think you have to be religious to believe in the afterlife. Simon questioned why he'd had this experience and yet he'd never had it in life before. We can't really answer that for him, can we? But there are several possibilities. He may have been in such a relaxed state that for the first time in his life, he was able to pick up on those messages. But if we look and we see that his sister and his niece were also contacted, I would say it was something possible to do with the family. Sometimes when we hear a disembodied voice or a clang or a bang, we instantly feel fear, and we've been taught to do that. But that could just be a relative letting you know that they're around. "I can see you" could be nice as "I can see you" is negative. Sometimes it's in the mind of the beholder. I hope Sammy gets some answers, and there are lots of people out there I know that have heard audible voices who will probably resonate with what he's put. Our next reports come from Sweden, from a lovely lady known as Lavender Pearls, and she's one of my regular listeners. How did a man who could not move find himself on the edge of his bed? Pearl said, "Here's an account of what I experienced in a suburb of Stockholm while working as a care assistant in the early 2000s. I'd been sent to help to look after an elderly man, who I will refer to as John. During the daytime, there were always two carers with him in his large ground floor flat. Upon arriving, my colleagues would introduce herself and John, And while having a coffee, my colleague, who I will refer to as Anna, gave me some background about John's medical conditions. He was confined to a wheelchair and his movement was very limited. He was unable to stand or bear any weight on his legs at all. Remember that sentence, as it's highly relevant later in my account. John's speech had been affected by one of his conditions, but he did a good job in helping us understand. It was a warm summer day, and John wanted to go for a walk. I was pleased about that, as I felt a sense of not being at all welcome in that flat, a feeling which didn't come from John or Anna in any way. Plus, it was very chilly in one corner of the living room, when the rest of the flat was warm. During the next few days, I was sent to John to learn how to look after him. Each day, I felt as if something didn't want me there. The cold corner of the living room didn't warm up either. There were lots of tiny holes in the wall in the cold corner. I asked why, and Anna told me that they tried many times to hang a picture there, but it had never stayed up. The right hook had been used for a concrete wall, but it always fell out, and the picture ended up on the desk underneath. I thought it was weird, but I didn't think it was anything paranormal. I just didn't join up the dots until later. After a couple of weeks, my boss told me I had to work nights. The holiday season had begun and there was no choice. I didn't want to be there at night. In fact, I didn't want to be there at all, as the feeling I wasn't wanted had grown much stronger. Added to that, I felt I was being watched, scrutinised sometimes. My skin felt prickly and sometimes I felt nauseous, very tired. I was drained of energy when it was at its worst. I'd started to wonder if the flat was haunted. The first night was absolutely ghastly. The telephone would ring, but the telephone number gadget would show either a row of dashes or just random numbers, not a telephone number. It rang time and time again throughout the night. And as I walked into the living room from the kitchen, I saw a dark, grey, transparent cloud move from the cold corner across the wall, and part of it dissolved into the front door and the wall. The whole of the living room was freezing cold. I could see my breath. This was a summer night. There was no doubt in my mind now that these things were connected to the paranormal. Before going to bed, though I was too scared to sleep, I made a sandwich and a cup of tea. I sat at the kitchen table. I was still cold. The feeling that I was being watched came again. Whatever was watching me was standing very close. I kept saying the Lord's Prayer, tried to stay calm. There was a small pot plant standing on a long rectangular cloth in the middle of the table. I felt the soil to see if it needed watering, and it did. What happened next scared the shit out of me. I got up from the table to put my cup and plate in the dishwasher and fill the watering can. And when I turned around, the pot plant had moved to the end of the table closest to me. It was literally millimetres from falling off the edge. I knew I hadn't moved it. One more millimetre and it would have fallen off the table. Although I didn't hear any laughter, I sensed something that was laughing at me, mocking me. After watering the plants, I went to check on John. Thankfully, he was sound asleep. Over the following weeks, I worked nights there a number of times. The telephone would ring, but nobody would ever be there. The grey cloud would sometimes appear and dissolve into the front door. I could never sleep, so I stayed up watching TV. The channel would suddenly change. The corner was still cold, and sometimes the rest of the living room would feel unseasonably cold. And sometimes I'd hear a kitchen cupboard bang shut, but there'd be nobody there. The cold water tap in the kitchen would be turned on and left running. The freezer door would be opened and just left open. I asked tentatively if my colleagues could get any sleep when they were there, and they said yeah. I asked my boss if I could change and work nights somewhere else, but she was having none of that. Of course, I couldn't tell her why. She wasn't particularly pleasant at the best of times, so I realised I just have to put up with it. I dreaded being alone there. I dreamed my boyfriend and talked to him for comfort. He was a spiritual and calm man, and he believed that there was nothing that couldn't be beaten. One night, I called him during the early hours of the morning. I was crying and shaking. This is what happened. John had called out, and I went to see what he wanted. And to my shock, he was sitting on the end of his bed with his legs dangling over. That was physically impossible for John to do by himself. And I said, "What the I don't know who was the most gobsmacked, me or John." He told me he didn't know how he got there. He woke up sitting there like that. He was frightened, and his skin was very cold to the touch. The bedroom was freezing, and with the help of the ceiling lift, I got John back into bed. I made him a hot drink, and I asked again how he managed to get out of bed and sit at the end. And as I said, that was physically impossible for him. We had to use a hoist. And honestly, I don't believe that he did that by himself. John was frightened by something, but he couldn't say what it was. On one of my days off, another boss called me and asked if I'd work a day shift instead. I was going to take the place of a colleague who had a hospital appointment that day, and she'd work my night shift instead. I was so relieved. This, I believe, was meant to be. The colleague I worked with that day, call her Jane, had also worked nights there. We hit it off straight away. During the day, she tentatively asked me if I'd experienced anything strange there. She very obviously had, and I asked her to explain first. Jane had experienced basically the same things, including finding John sitting at the foot of his bed with his legs dangling over. It was a relief for both of us to be able to talk about it. Thankfully, my last night shift there was fast approaching. However, the phenomenon had one more treat in store for me. On this particular night, I'd gone to check on John, who was sleeping like a baby. I went from his bedroom, through the hallway and into the living room on my way to the kitchen. Suddenly, something stopped me in my tracks, literally. I was suddenly standing in front of maybe a portal. I don't know what else to call it. In front of me was a type of marketplace, but I would say hundreds of years ago. It was raining heavily. There were people around me dressed in clothes from hundreds of years ago. There were cobblestones, and the people seemed totally unaware of me. They walked past me and through me, so it seemed. They were dirty and unkempt, and then suddenly it was all gone. I sat on the sofa. I couldn't understand what the hell had just happened. Although it was very late, I called my boyfriend and told him what I'd seen. He suggested it was a portal, and I may have seen a scene from that area, as it was far back in history, and that seemed logical. While sitting on the sofa watching TV one night at John's flat, I experienced something which scared me. In the cold corner of the living room there was the desk. The telephone was on there and various other things. Something caught my attention, and I saw the pencil start to roll off the desk. It stopped at the edge and then fell onto the floor. It stopped again, and then it rolled towards me, maybe 2 or 3 feet, and then stopped suddenly. I was on the sofa. John was in bed. There's nobody else there. Anyway, thank goodness, there were no more night shifts there after that, just a few day shifts. During those day shifts, I met John's brother, who had moved into the area to be able to visit every day. He had complained to staff that we were buying and stealing light bulbs. Long story short, the bulbs didn't last more than a few days in the living room, and that's why we had to buy so many. He had the electrics checked by a professional electrician. No fault could be found. So, Debs, that's where my experience into the mysterious flat took me. My boyfriend did some research to try and find out what had been on that land before and what, if anything, had happened there, but he never found anything. The paranormal experiences from my current job I'll put in another email. I know so many other people who have experiences they cannot explain. And every time a new person shares, that makes it easier for them. Pearl. I wonder what it was about that flat, and John, and that dark corner. There are so many possibilities, aren't there? I wondered at a time if maybe it was John that was doing this as his body worked less and less. His abilities, telekinesis, whatever name we want to give it, improved greatly. But that doesn't seem right because John liked having her around, and clearly, whatever that entity was, it didn't like having other people around. Very strange story indeed. But it gets better. She actually worked in a haunted shop and she shared those experiences with me as well. Thank you for featuring my experiences with the paranormal at my former job, Deb. I miss your live show, so it was a nice surprise to find you featured it. I'd mentioned to you in my first email that my current place of work is also haunted, and I would love to tell you about it, so here goes. I work for a major charity in one of their large second-hand shops. I'm responsible for the large clothing department. We have various departments. We sell glass, china, pottery, textiles, and most kinds, paintings, lamps, books, and loads of other stuff. The shop's located just a few kilometres from the city. It's very popular. We do well, which makes the work hard, but worth it. We help a lot of people. I have been employed at the shop for going on 18 months when I had my first experience there. One afternoon, I was standing in a narrow corridor at the back of the shop. There was a large box with some bits and bobs in it, and I was looking for something specific when I had a feeling someone wanted to get past me. I moved in a bit, to let them pass, and I felt the air move as they did, you know what I mean. But when I looked, nobody was there. The corridor's a dead end, so there was no one near me. Anyway, I didn't think much about it. I didn't immediately think it was paranormal, just something strange. A few weeks or so passed, and I was in my room one day working. My colleague came in and told me she was going home. I told her to shut the front door properly. Customers don't always realise it was shut, and despite the door being locked and the lights out and the shut sign is up, some still try and wrench the door off, to get in. If the lock doesn't click properly into place, anyone can come in, which isn't nice if you're in there alone. There was no doubt she shut the door properly. After just a couple of minutes or so, I heard what sounded like someone walking around the shop with cups and saucers on a metal tray, kind of clinking together. I knew it wasn't my colleague as I'd seen her go past my window. I went into the shop, fully expecting to find a customer there, but there was no one there at all. I switched the lights on, called out, checked everywhere. No, I was alone. I thought it was strange, but I turned the lights off and returned to my room. A few minutes later, I heard the exact same clinking noises. Once again, I checked, but nobody was there. This time, I felt as if I wasn't alone. I felt a female presence. Nothing unpleasant, nothing bad or malevolent. I can't exactly explain how I knew it was the presence of an elderly woman, but I did. I was sure of it. Because I wasn't afraid, I tried to communicate with her. I said something like, "I feel you're here, it's all right. Don't be frightened of me, please." There wasn't any kind of response that I could detect. I returned to the room. Over the next few hours, I heard occasional footsteps, but no clinking sounds. There was no sense of malevolence or anything bad, thank goodness. I mentioned all this to a colleague who was often alone in the shop. She wasn't at all surprised. She told me the lights would often switch on or off by themselves, or a book would fall off a shelf. She'd hear footsteps. She hadn't experienced anything bad either. She told me she believed people were looking for their possessions. When a relative clears a house after a death in the family, we often get the deceased clothes, like porcelain, etc. And she believes that they're looking for their things, which makes a lot of sense when you think about it. That was several years ago, and I've experienced much more activity in the shop when I'm alone. To hear footsteps is not at all unusual, nor is it unusual to hear the sound of paper carrier bags being scrunched up or someone calling out, "Hello." Sometimes I feel as if someone's standing by the entrance to my room watching me. Not to scare me, just watching. I often say out loud, "I know you're there, it's okay." I can't explain how I know, but my belief is that the presences I feel at the shop are not the same every time. I mean, I think they're just visiting, looking for their stuff. Some may not realise they're dead, they're just passing through. I seem to pick up strongly on female presences more than a male. They're always elderly. On one occasion, and only one, I saw a large shadow disappear into a wall, but there were no bad vibes connected to it at all. The shop was built in the late 1950s and has been used for various businesses over the years. I don't feel anything I've experienced has been connected to its past. So that's my account of experiences at the shop. The complete opposite to the other job. Thank God. I have a feeling that she's right, that each of those valued possessions are in there that you would want again after you'd passed on, or you'd want your family member to have, and unpacking up the house they didn't realise that it was so important to you. It makes perfect sense, doesn't it? It's just people coming and going and enjoying the things as they did in life. There is an account from Ardaki Lodge that's right next to Loch Ness in the Scottish Highlands, and that features a crawling woman, which is absolutely disturbing. But I'll let you decide that for yourself. Ardaki Lodge stands on the shores of Loch Ness in the Scottish Highlands. And in December of 1952, Peter McEwen and his wife Dorothy moved in with plans to turn the land into farming. And some months later, they were doing well, so they advertised for a housekeeper and a farmhand to help out with the now ever expanding farm. The ad was answered by a couple called MacDonald, who were taken on and given accommodation at the lodge. It was soon after their arrival that Mrs. MacDonald began to hear disembodied footsteps moving around the house at night. She reported her experiences and concerns to the McEwens. They listened with interest, but reassured the housekeeper, saying it was probably just the creaks and knocks of an old building settling down in the cool of the evening. Yet Mrs. MacDonald continued to hear the unnerving sounds. Curiously, neither her husband nor the McEwens heard anything strange. The housekeeper, however, insisted that she could hear the footsteps and that she believed them to be the ghost of an old woman. The McEwens would have none of it and put it to MacDonald that it was all in her mind. One night, things came to a terrifying climax. Before retiring to bed, the housekeeper went to the kitchen door, which led out onto a hallway. As she opened the door and looked out, she saw the apparition of an old woman by the stairs. The figure was on her hands and knees and began to crawl slowly towards her. This terrified Mrs. MacDonald. She said she couldn't discern any clear features, yet the wraith seemed barely human and began to come closer. The housekeeper slammed the kitchen door and fled to her husband. The next day, they left the house. Ardaki Lodge stood until 1968, when it was demolished by the army. Despite its demise, its reputation as the house of the crawling woman was never sealed. She may still be there. She may still use that energy of that land to show herself on occasion. I wonder if she was an old owner of some kind, or an entity that would show itself in a way that filled its agenda. I received an email from somebody who had grandparents that kind of sensed things, and I think that Mrs. MacDonald was like that. I've spoken to a number of people in the last couple of months whose parents or grandparents had a paranormal gift of some kind, and maybe that's what Mrs. MacDonald had, and that's why she could experience it far more than anybody else. I mean, it appeared as an old lady in the beginning, or just your natural footsteps, and then turned into something far more malevolent. But in our next case, as I say, I received an email recently from a lovely lady who shared her paranormal and supernatural experiences with me, and we've discussed what it was like being a witness to the unexplained at an early age. The case I'm sharing today gives a very good example of what it's like to live a lifetime with weird things happening around you. Now, for the purposes of anonymity, I'm going to call our witness D, and D said, "Hi Deb, I really hope you don't mind me contacting you about this. The email's a bit long, I'm afraid, but I want to give you as much background information in the hopes of explaining to you what's happened around me since I was a young age. I had a lot of paranormal experiences, stretching back as far as I can remember. My mum has said that from the age when I could talk, it was clear I was seeing things. I've always seen stuff. My mum, maternal grandmother also have this sensitivity to things, except both my mum and my nan felt stuff rather than seeing it like I do. I grew up in Somerset and we moved up to Shropshire border several years ago. The first weird experience I remember happened around my 6th birthday. My primary school had arranged a day out to Longley Estate, which is a fantastic stately home which you could visit, and of course the famous safari park. Mum came on as an extra pair of hands and eyes on the trip with us. During the tour of the gorgeous Elizabethan manor house, my mum noticed that I seemed distracted by someone. It appeared that I was watching someone moving across the room towards the door. She asked me what I was looking at, and I said, "That pretty lady in the grey dress." Well, as the tour came to an end, Mum asked one of the guides if the house was haunted. Evidently it was, and people would report seeing her just as I had. She's known as the Grey Lady. That happened in 1972, 73. Luckily, both Nan and Mum understood about this type of thing. I was taken seriously and never told I was daft or to stop telling tales. I think this could be why I never lost the ability. It's my thought that when I was a child, it's always told I'm making stuff up. That sort of switches off that ability. Another experience happened when I was around the age of 9. My nan lived in a little village of Buckland Dinham near Frome in Somerset. My granddad was buried in the churchyard there, and I would regularly go to visit his grave with Nan. I spent a lot of time with her, and we were very close. She's now with Grandad in the same spot. On one of these visits, I went for a little walk into another part of the graveyard, and I saw a little girl. She looked a little younger than I was at the time. She had light brown hair, wearing a cream-coloured dress with a satin ribbon sash tied around the waist. She was about 40 feet in front of me, and then she walked behind a gravestone and didn't reappear. When I told Nan, she came with me to have a look, but we didn't see her, and Nan just said I'd been very lucky to see her. Another weird event happened when I was 11. I was rushed into Royal United Hospital, Bath, and had to have an emergency surgery because of my appendix burst. On the way from the theatre, I left my body. I was positioned above and behind the trolley. I was laying up. I could see myself on the trolley being pushed by a male nurse. On either side of me were 2 female nurses. The one on the right was pushing a drip holder, and the one on the left had a hand on a sheet covering me. And suddenly, I saw myself start to struggle, and the nurse was trying to hold my arms. I was watching this as I was still above and behind the trolley being wheeled away from me. I then saw myself pull a tube out of my nose. The trolley was going through like a pair of double doors, and then I sort of slipped down towards the trolley and the memory ended. I was pretty ill for about a week and kept sedated in ICU. As I came around, a nurse came up to check on me, and it was the same nurse. I said, "I'm really sorry for fighting and pulling on that tube." She looked really shocked. Mum asked what I meant, and I told them what I'd seen. Apparently, because I was so ill and had been in, touch and go for a few days at first, they hadn't even told Mum what had happened to me. They didn't want to cause more worry for her and Dad. I still don't quite understand what happened. But when I talked to that nurse, she said, I described exactly what had happened, even down to her resting her hand on the sheet covering me. I don't know if this has any link to the paranormal things I've experienced, but that memory is as clear today as it was in the late 1970s when it happened. Another more recent experience happened during the first lockdown in 2020. I drove to the local shop and parked up. I saw an elderly chap to my right, starting to walk towards the shop. As I got out of the car, he was about maybe 30 feet or so away from me. He was wearing a tweed jacket and a cap, and he had a stick with him. And I said, "Good morning" to him, and he smiled and replied. Went to the cash point. I could hear him walking towards me. I could hear the stones crunch and the top of his stick. The door to the shop was about 6 feet to my right in clear view. I heard the chap stop, and I assumed he was waiting to get cash too. As I got my money, I turned round and said, "Sorry for holding you up. I'll get out of the way now." And he wasn't there. There was no sign of him at all. He hadn't gone into the shop, and there was nowhere he could have gone in that short time. I've had many other experiences like these over the years. I've had some where I feel weird or uncomfortable, like I've walked into a big cobweb or into an area of dense, cold fog, but I've never felt afraid. This next incident, and the one I contacted you about, is the only time I've ever felt fear of something I couldn't see. I now live on the Shropshire-Powys border, about 10 miles from Wrexham, and about the same from Llangollen. There's an old-aged hill fort about a mile from where I live now, as well as several castles and Offa's Dyke. This experience was so odd that I actually made a note in my phone calendar when it happened. I suffer from chronic pain, and when I was having a good day, I like to go for a wander in the wooded area around my house. On Saturday, the August 6, 2022, my mum and I went for a walk. I'm fortunate to still have both my parents, and I spend as much time with them as I can. It was about 10:30 a.m., a gorgeous day. We walked through the green belt towards my home. It's a popular place for dog walkers. A little further along, there's a playing field and a park area, and a few fields and a pond. As we walked through the trees, we were looking out for birds and squirrels and bugs. It was just a totally normal walk. And then suddenly, with no reason, it went deadly quiet. It was like a switch had been flipped. My mum and I both stopped dead in our tracks, and Mum said, "It's gone bloody quiet," and then said, "Do you feel anything?" We both had this awful feeling of being watched. I had that weird prickly feeling on my back, when you know there's someone behind you. We both looked around but saw nothing. We cut the walk short and began heading back. A few minutes later, sounds started up again. The birds gradually started singing and buzzing. Everything came back to life. Mum and I talked about this several times, and we both put it down to something paranormal. But I've never felt fear like that before. I've walked around there probably hundreds of times. It's such a lovely place to walk. I've now had that same intense feeling of fear 3 times in total while walking there. All of these were in August and September of last year, and during the day. I've walked around there this year a few times. It felt totally normal. It's probably nothing. But after hearing the reports of stuff that's happened pretty close to where I did feel those things, I wanted to let you know. I'm not bothered about being anonymous. I'm at the age now where I don't worry about what others think. These things have always happened around my family. All those close to me know about my strange experience. I knew there had been odd reports from the Gresford area and all over through Cheshire too, and I wonder if any of these are linked. Before I continue, I want to pick up on something of the things our witness said. Her name's Dawn, actually, and she pointed out the feeling of being watched that comes on suddenly. Pearl mentioned it also, that your senses are picking up on the fact that you're being observed when this happens. The second was the sudden deadly silence. It's mentioned so often by many people, where all of the birds suddenly stop singing. The sound of the trees becomes muffled, and you can tell that the atmosphere has changed. We would have trusted that back in the day. It would have saved our lives. So it's strange to me that we're taught to dismiss it. She said on many visits to this area everything was fine, but for a few days things felt different. But on that one particular visit, that feeling intensified. Dawn stated she was always encouraged with her abilities and never made to feel silly or dramatic, which is something which is rare in this subject. Family, peers and other folk will dismiss a child's explanation for who they're talking to. Dawn's mum, even as a small baby, knew she was picking up on something, that something was visiting. We should be encouraging our children's experience. We don't know why it's happening, then we tell them that, rather than explain it away as something that they're doing wrong. Don't be so silly, don't be so naughty, stop making things up, don't be daydreaming. It has to be the other way around, doesn't it? Because so many people go through these experiences. In doing so, we normalise these conversations for adults and children alike. The next experience I'm going to share with you is called My Paranormal Experiences. And they were shared with me by BBR witness Daniel. He said, I'm almost 52 years of age, but when I was 8, I lived in Howard Road in Cambridge and walked every day from home to Fen Ditton School in the nearby village. Our art teacher lived in a mansion house close to the village church, and she told us of hearing strange noises in the night, like disembodied footsteps and the chinking of money, which she believed was the ghostly sound of workers who had died while building the house, counting their pay. Walking from the church, there was a path leading to Howard Road. It was a quicker route, cutting through the hedgerow, with fields on either side. It was known to us children as Snake Path. Slightly down the path was also a right-hand bend, leading to the mansion and the other house. One night, I decided to brave it on my grifter bicycle. I had always had terrible fears. I was afraid of being alone in the room, afraid of the noise of the toilet flush, and very afraid of the dark. As I headed down the path and I neared the bend, I saw a man in a top hat and tails, standing ahead of me in front of the gate to the field behind him. He had a beard, he was white in colour, and I could see through him. I stopped and placed my feet on the floor. What happened next traumatised me to this day. I don't know which version is true. Either he began to walk towards me, and I pedalled away like greased lightning in terrible fear, which is most likely, or he walked towards me and stood beside me as I remained there, petrified, and bent down and turned his face towards me. At which point I pedalled away from him and rode home in terrible fear. I think the first version is the most likely, and in the second it's probably my imagination due to the fear, but I can't be certain of that. I've been back to that spot a couple of times in adulthood and felt chills up my spine, but I saw nothing. My mother has spoken of seeing fairies around the bonfire in the back garden of the home, and also a spirit in the form of an indigenous American. My great-great-grandmother, great-grandmother and grandmother were all mediums. I only met my grandmother a few times and stayed a short while at her house when I was visiting there. But I do remember reading newspaper clippings about her and her ghost-busting stories. In 1997, I lived in Victoria Road, Cambridge. I was given a room in a set of buildings by the Housing Association. One day, while laying on my bed looking at the ceiling with my eyes wide open, I suddenly saw what I can only describe as a very large black silk handkerchief, and it appeared under the ceiling above me. It glided from one side of the ceiling to the other and disappeared. A momentary shudder of fear passed through me. However, it was not my own fear, but the spirit of fear that has always been in me, having gained access to me through trauma. I believe I saw a demon. However, of its name or purpose, I have no idea to this day. I would agree with Daniel that this is probably something that runs in his family life, as with most of the witnesses we've heard about tonight. Paul Pilot shared his report and he said, Springfield was one of a row of 3 cottages built by my great-great-grandfather on Lock Road, which was then a quiet country lane in a small village on the south coast of Hampshire. The initial white painted detached house was known as Dorcas Cottage, being my great great grandfather's family home, with the two other pairs of Edwardian semis built later for his sons, one of whom was my great grandfather. Dorcas Cottage was born from tragedy, being named after my great grandfather's sister, who was murdered by her boyfriend on a railway bridge in a nearby lane. Soon after, there were two more tragedies. In the early 1900s, my grandmother's 4-year-old brother Joe fell into a copper boiler and died from scalding, followed a few years later by her mother, slowly dying a painful death at the hands of the consumption. Some 50 years later, my father, not being one for superstition or the paranormal, was shocked to see what he strongly believed to be the semi-transparent apparition of a lady in white Edwardian type dress drifting around the site of the tragedy. My grandmother always used to tell us that she did not like being in that vicinity when walking back from her house after visiting her brother and sisters late in the evening. I personally had a very similar experience some years later, with a sense of being watched and some very strange noises, bangs and rattles from inside an adjacent outbuilding. The haunted spot has since been developed and now accommodates a rather cramped new build house. The house had a host of strange goings on several occasions. There were occurrences in the early 2000s before the last of my family members moved out. My grandmother had sadly passed away by then, but I felt her presence and not entirely left the house, I don't think, which by this time was now being lived in solely by my uncle and his wife. On one particular occasion, a visitor to the house was reversing, and he swore somebody had just walked behind the car into her reversing lights. When asked to describe who she'd seen, she described my grandmother in such detail that she even described her hair and posture and style and the colour of her clothes. The witness had never met my grandmother, who passed away a year or so previously. On one occasion, my wife and I were visiting my uncle and his wife, and they were seated in the lounge. My uncle was standing in the doorway, discussing something controversial, which my grandmother would not have appreciated, when tremendous banging and shaking started from the staircase behind him. This could not be explained, but my uncle bizarrely ignored the unexplained noises. We later found out that his wife often used to hear my grandmother's voice calling her name in a scolding fashion, and it made her frankly petrified. A few months later, this old up moved out, and we helped them move. And as they left the house for the final time, she closed her eyes. She didn't look back, and she said, "Just get me out of here." We were recently discussing a strange experience in the old house during a Christmas party, at which, after years of denial, my uncle admitted that strange things had happened to him whilst he lived there. We all hated going upstairs after dark, as there would be a strange atmosphere, almost evil. My sister spoke of a time when she had a nightmare in which she went to our great aunt's room in the house, only to be confronted by a boy in Edwardian clothes climbing through the window. She dismissed this as just a bad dream until she visited our confused old great aunt, who seemed very upset with her. When asked what was the matter, she snapped at my sister and said, "Why did you come into my room with that boy the other night?" And my sister replied that she'd not, only to be told, "I didn't come in with a boy." "Yes, you did. You came through the window with that boy." And that was over 25 years ago. And the experience still troubles my sister. Sounds to me like his family members have never left their home. The paranormal, the supernatural, are words that we bandy about quite often. And they're strange words because they literally mean around normal. And it is normal for people to grow up in homes where they see and feel and experience activity. What's not normal is that we place on them the burden of keeping it a secret. There are so many of us that experience things. It might be a one-off event, and it might be a lifetime of them. But having that conversation about them normalises it for the next person to come along. If we hadn't sat and listened to these stories tonight, they would have died off and gone into oblivion and we wouldn't know about them. Storytelling is a wonderful ability us humans have to pass on history and lore and experiences using your oral voice. You know, whether you type it, you're a vlogger, you're an article writer, it doesn't matter. It's a craft. The same as a leather maker, a baker, or somebody who paints. It comes to all of us. And some of us just like to enjoy the stories. So I hope you've enjoyed the stories I've shared with you tonight. And I will be back at the same time on the same day next week with even more stories like this. I'm going to be sharing a case with you where the young boy could levitate and some other really interesting cases from the BBR case files. So until then, I wish you good night. It's very frosty and foggy out there for me, and I hope the weather's a bit better for you guys. But each day now, as we go on, we get one day more closer to spring, and that brings us closer to summer. So until then, good night, everyone.